Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. She is alive when a beggar interrupts a funeral, and steel gray sky covered the city of Charleston, as if even the clouds were mourning the passing of a man whose influence extended far beyond the skyscrapers he had erected. The drizzle fell silently on the ancient cobblestones, and the city seemed to hold its breath. In front of the Harper and Sons funeral home, the black sedans with tinted windows advanced slowly, one after the other, like a procession of ghosts come to greet a fallen king. The doors opened, and tall figures in dark coats stepped out, their faces frozen in a stiff dignity. Bankers, senators, judges, former business partners. All knew each other. All came to greet Richard Beaumont, real estate titan and discreet lord of the entire American Southeast. At a distance, behind a security barrier, journalists watched, cameras on their shoulders, feverish pens in hand. They whispered names, recognizing here a former governor, there a business star. But their eyes searched for another face, that of Thomas Beaumont, silent heir to the empire. Inside the funeral hall, the atmosphere was as cold as it is solemn. Of the matte crystal chandeliers cast a soft light on the guests' closed faces. The coffin, made of polished mahogany, sat in the center on an ivory carpet. Around it, an ocean off-white roses, orchids, and lilies filled the air with an almost sacred scent. Standing beside the coffin, Thomas Beaumont, impeccably dressed in his 30s, wore a tailored midnight blue suit, without a single stain. His features were drawn, his eyes reddened, but his bearing remained dignified. On his arm, Olivia Hartman, sublime in her fitted black dress, rested a delicate hand on her hip. Longtime fiancée from an old East Coast family, she embodied elegance and control. Together, they formed a perfect picture. The ceremony was drawing to a close. The priest spoke the last words of a studied tribute. And now we give back to God a man of courage and vision. But just as he was about to close his missal, a hoarse, foreign voice cut through the air like a clap of thunder. Sir, she's alive. There was silence immediate, brutal conversations froze. Eyes turned toward the front door, where the voice had come from. An old black man stood there. His torn clothes were still dripping with rain. His worn boots left dark marks on the light marble. His white beard trembled slightly, but his gaze was burning with truth. He seemed to have come from another world, a stranger in a kingdom of wealth and power. Who are you? Thomas asked, his voice lower than expected, surprised, uncertain. The man took a step forward. His knees bent slightly, but his column remained straight, like that of a man who had seen too much to bend any longer. My name is Walter Green, and I tell you again, sir, your mother is not dead. She is still alive. A collective shudder ran through the assembly. A murmur, at first discreet, rose like a wave. His mother? Eleanor? But she died in a fire. It was 25 years ago. He's delusional. Olivia, pale, tried to place her hand on Thomas's arm, but he couldn't feel her anymore. Thomas felt like the ground was opening up beneath him. Heart pounding, ears ringing, he stared at the man as if he had just awakened a ghost. His gaze instinctively went to his father's coffin. This day was no longer a goodbye. It was the beginning of earthquake. That same evening, the residence Beaumont seemed colder than ever. The sprawling colonial-style mansion, high above Charleston, was bathed in a hushed darkness, broken only by the warm light from a wood-paneled study. The walls were covered with family portraits, antique canvases, and shelves filled with legal relics and awards. Sitting behind a large mahogany desk, Thomas Beaumont nervously twirled his wedding ring between his fingers. In front of him, a barely opened glass of bourbon reflected the flames of a quiet fire in the fireplace. The ticking of an antique clock could be heard. An electric tension hung in the room. There was a double knock. Thomas looked up. Come in. Elliot Saunders, the family lawyer for 30 years, entered with measured steps. Wearing a tailored gray suit, a leather briefcase, and gold-rimmed glasses, he had the look of someone who knows too much and says little. Thomas stared at him without a word, then broke the silence. You always told me my mother, Eleanor, died in that fire in Savannah. You showed me reports. A death certificate. There was even a ceremony. You looked me straight in the eye and told me there was no doubt. Elliot licked his lips. His usually impassive face betrayed unusual discomfort. Thomas. I saw the report myself. The fire was raging. The body found in the house was unrecognizable. The medical examiner concluded it was her. There was no chance of survival. But Thomas slowly sat up in his chair, his eyes fixed on the man he had always considered an uncle. Something was wrong. A glimmer, perhaps imperceptible to others, shone in the lawyer's eyes. A glimmer of guilt, or worse, of knowledge. You're lying. Or at least, you're not telling me everything. I saw it. In your eyes, earlier, during the ceremony. That name, that face, it wasn't a surprise to you. Elliot looked away. A deep wrinkle formed between his brows. What I know, I knew too late, Thomas. And I didn't have the courage. The courage of what? But Elliot stood up, briefcase in hand, and concluded in a whisper. Be careful. What you seek could destroy you. He left the room, leaving Thomas alone in the shadows, more confused than ever. That night, Thomas did not sleep. He got up at 3 a.m, crossed the hall to the room where his father kept the family archives. He switched on a lamp, unlocked an old chest, and rummaged through it. Photo albums where his mother's pictures had been cut out, and signed letters, coded account books. A life erased, voluntarily. He knew almost nothing about Eleanor Beaumont, if not what her father was willing to let slip, that she was fragile, that she could not bear the weight of their world, and that a tragic fire had taken her away when Thomas was only 8 years old. But why had there never been an official burial? Why had no member of his maternal family ever contacted him? Why this void? The next day, first thing in the morning, he contacted a woman his father would have hated, Maggie Reed. A former NYPD detective fired for exposing internal corruption. Maggie had a reputation for being rough, insightful, and dangerously honest. She lived in a trailer off the beaten track in South Georgia. When she picked up, her raspy voice simply said, "If it's to keep an eye on your wife, I don't do adultery. I'm looking for someone. Someone who's supposed to have been dead for 25 years. My mother." There was a 3-second silence. "I'm coming. Send me everything you have." In less than 5 days, Maggie redid what police investigators had never bothered to do. She traced Amon, who disappeared in 1999, a former domestic employee of the Beaumont family, now living in a Columbia hospice under the name Walter Green. Thomas went there with her. The establishment was modest. The old man, now bedridden, had a face wrinkled by time, but his eyes remained clear. When he recognized Thomas, he smiled sadly. "I'd recognize you among 1,000. You look too much like her." Thomas approached, stunned. "Did you know her?" "My mother." Walter nodded slowly, then whispered, "I helped her escape, you understand? She couldn't take it anymore. He was laying hands on her. He was locking her up. She wanted to live. She wanted to take you with her, but he threatened her. She waited until you were older. Then one day, we set fire to the outbuilding. It was me, yes, but it was a controlled fire. The body we found was a homeless man we had picked up a few days before. It was a risky plan, but she survived. And you thought she was dead." Thomas took a step back, breathless, his heart beating like a drum. Tears welled up in his eyes. His father, this monument of honor, had created a perfect lie. Walter added in a whisper, "I can tell you where she is, but you have to be ready. She's not the woman she used to be." And in the silence that followed, Thomas understood that his whole life had just changed. It is in a small rural hospital in Willow Creek, south of Georgia, that Maggie Reed finally got his hands on a woman registered under the name of Helen Gray. The facility, modest and isolated, housed psychiatric patients forgotten by the world. The corridors smelled of bleach and abandonment. Maggie, accustomed to the harshest scenes, couldn't help but slow down as she walked towards room 214. She knew that behind that door might be the missing heart of the Beaumont family. The medical record was a notebook of wounds and silences. Severe head trauma after an unspecified fall, chronic partial amnesia, recurrent dissociative delusions, 12 transfers of establishment in 20 years, no visitors registered. But above all, a DNA sample, discreetly compared to Thomas's, had confirmed the unthinkable. Helen Gray was indeed Eleanor Beaumont. When Thomas entered the room, the world seemed to stop. The room was bare except for a metal bed, a veiled window, and a small plastic table on which rested an old book of poetry. A woman with long hair, turned almost entirely white, sat in silence, her gaze lost in an invisible garden. She was wearing an oversized hospital gown, and her thin, trembling hands held a handkerchief. When she slowly turned her head, her eyes met Thomas's. He felt his knees weaken. His heart raced, caught between anxiety and hope. She blinked, struggled with her memory for a moment, then whispered in a raspy, almost broken voice, "Are you, Thomas? My little boy?" The ground gave way beneath her feet. He knelt beside her, placed his hands in hers, and answered in a whisper, "It's me, Mom. I'm here." And then they cried, shamelessly, wordlessly, like two souls separated by time, fear, and lies. She gently ran her hand over his cheek, as if to make sure he was real. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes brightened. For a moment, she was no longer a forgotten patient. She was a mother. Back in Charleston, the revelation came as a bomb in a shrine. Eleanor Beaumont, thought to have been dead for 25 years, was alive. Her return cast a chilling shadow over the legacy of Richard Beaumont, once considered a respectable and unassailable man. But the truth was more sinister. As Thomas searched the archives, interviewed relatives, and confronted those who had experienced the era, a horrific picture emerged. His father, behind the mask of the philanthropist, had been a violent, authoritarian, control-obsessed man. Eleanor had wanted to leave, had talked about divorce, had threatened to denounce him. He locked her up. He beat her. He terrorized her. When she tried to run away, he did what a powerful man knew how to do: orchestrated his disappearance. Richard had paid off police officers, bribed a judge, had a fake death certificate, and attributed an unidentified burned body to his wife. He had told the story of an accidental fire. Everyone had accepted it. No one had checked. Except Walter Green, the old butler, who had seen, heard, and suffered in silence, had risked everything to save Eleanor. He had set fire to an empty outbuilding and arranged for her evacuation in a stolen car. He thought she would be free, but she hadn't escaped injury. The escape had turned into mental wandering. Thomas Beaumont, heir to an empire built on lies, found himself facing a heartbreaking moral choice. He could have covered it up, had his mother committed again, silenced Walter Green, maintained the pristine image of the Beaumont dynasty. But he did the opposite. He summoned a press conference, broadcast live on all national channels. The cameras captured his determined face. His words were clear, trembling with emotion, but laden with truth. "My name is Thomas Beaumont. Today, I wish to speak not as an heir, but as a son. My mother, Eleanor, is alive. My father, Richard Beaumont, lied. He silenced her. He betrayed everything his name stood for. Today, I give my mother her voice back. And I do justice to Walter Green, who was her only savior." The world was stunned. Some business partners withdrew. Shareholders threatened. But popular support was immense. For the first time, an heir wasn't protecting the empire. He was exposing it to the light. Thomas recovered officially his mother's name, had her treated in a specialized clinic, far from the press. He created a multi-million-dollar fund in her name to help women who are victims of domestic violence. Olivia Hartman, his fiancée, could not bear this turnaround. She had loved him for his prestige, his position, his wealth, for the security he represented. She implored him to remain silent, to handle this as a family, to protect their future. He answered him coldly, "If our future depends on erasing a broken woman, then it's not mine." And he left her, without remorse. A year had passed since the truth had broken the silence of decades. The name Beaumont, once synonymous with quiet grandeur and real estate empire, now carried another connotation. That off-truth restored, humanity rediscovered. Thomas and Eleanor were now living in a light wooden house, nestled on the edge of a forest in Vermont. The building was modest, but bathed in light, with a large wild garden that the two were trying to tame. The pomp, the galas, the red carpets, and the crystal glasses were now just a distant echo, a mirage of the past. The new home exuded simplicity and peace. In the living room, an old typewriter sat on a small round table by the window. This was where Eleanor spent her mornings. Her handwriting was no longer fluent, but every word she wrote was a victory over silence, a reconquest of her voice. She had titled her current manuscript, "I Left Alive." Sometimes she would stop, look out the window at the trees, and whisper, "I thought the world had forgotten me, but you found me." Thomas, himself, had renounced any position in the family empire, leaving the shares to charities or to dissolution. He now ran the Eleanor Foundation, dedicated to women who had fled violent environments and to children who had grown up in silence. He met with these women every week, listened to their stories, and helped them regain their names, their strength, and their dignity. Every year, at first day of spring, Thomas and his mother undertook a sacred ritual to lay flowers on Walter Green's grave. The cemetery was located outside Columbia, in the shade of a gnarled old oak tree. His grave was simple, without extravagance, but to always freshly maintain the stone, which they had had engraved the previous year, bore a simple inscription. Walter Green, 1939 to 2024. The man who made freedom possible. That day, the wind was gentle, laden with the scent of lilacs and damp earth. Eleanor wore a beige coat and a pale silk scarf. She held a bouquet of violets, her favorite flowers, in her deformed fingers. They knelt in silence. She stroked the stone as one might stroke the hand of an old friend. "Without him, you wouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling but full of gratitude. Thomas looked up at the sky between the branches. "Without him, I wouldn't even know who I am." There was a moment of silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the past. It was one of peace, forgiveness, and gratitude. A beggar, an old man with clear eyes, had once dared break the course of the world by interrupting a ceremony designed for forgetting. That day, he had not simply denounced a lie. He had returned a mother to her son and a name for an erased woman. That day, a beggar interrupted a funeral. But that was not the end. It was a beginning.